The wind rolled down 7th Avenue with the steady push of early winter, sweeping dust into tight spirals that danced along the sidewalks of Harlem. Una Mulzac stepped off the bus with a small suitcase in one hand and a folder of papers pressed beneath her coat. The collar of her jacket snapped against her neck as she looked up at the neighborhood she had left behind years before. Storefronts she once recognized were gone. New ones had sprung up, their windows crowded with flyers, posters, and handwritten announcements about tenant meetings, school strikes, and community gatherings. Harlem was changing again. She could feel it in the rhythm of the streets, in the hurried conversations, in the sharpened edge of hope and frustration that seemed to hang over the blocks like a half-formed storm. She took a slow breath. The air cool and tinged with coal smoke. She had grown up just miles from here, but the years in British Guiana had stretched long. When she closed her eyes, she could still hear the echo of political marches, the shouting on crowded streets, the way fear and determination had mixed in the voices of those who refused to bend. That world had shaped her. It had scarred her, too. The political crackdown, the violence that reached her workplace, the fire that nearly took her life. All of it had left a mark no doctor could ever locate. Yet as she stood on the sidewalk, her feet planted firmly in Harlem's soil again, she felt the first beat of something familiar rising through her chest. Purpose. The paper in her folder bore the name she had written over and over during long nights when sleep refused to come. Liberation Bookstore. The idea had grown in her mind for years, beginning as a whisper, then a murmur, then a stubborn insistence. She had seen how books stirred people in British Guiana. She had watched readers pass worn pamphlets between them and speak in hushed voices about freedom, justice, and the right to be heard. Books had been weapons and lifelines. They had been sparks. She wanted to bring that spark to Harlem, especially now, in 1960, when the country itself seemed to tremble between its past and something new. She walked along 131st Street, her steps steady, but her heart thudding with an anxious rhythm. The building she sought was an old brownstone with a street-level shop front that had been shuttered for months. The landlord, an elderly man with a rough voice softened by kindness, had agreed to meet her again this morning. He had warned her that the space needed work, floors repaired, shelves rebuilt, paint scraped off in layers, the old sign taken down. She only needed a space. She could handle the rest. When she reached the building, the landlord was already waiting, keys rattling in his thick hand. He nodded to her, a half-smile tucked beneath his mustache. She greeted him warmly, and together they stepped inside. The air smelled of dust and forgotten stories. A thin blade of sunlight pushed through the front window, illuminating the faded wooden floorboards and the outlines of shelves left behind by the previous tenant. It was not beautiful. It was not even comfortable. But Una felt something shift inside her the moment she crossed the threshold. There was potential here. More than that, there was room for a new voice, a new rhythm, a new gathering place for people searching for knowledge and truth. She walked slowly through the narrow room, her fingers trailing across the empty shelves. She imagined them filled with books by Black authors from across the world. She imagined biographies of political thinkers, poetry written in the fire of resistance, novels that captured the dreams and burdens of a people who had endured generation after generation of struggle. She imagined young readers discovering their history for the first time, their eyes widening as they realized how much had been hidden from them. She imagined elders stepping inside to find books they had never been offered in school. She imagined activists planning meetings at the small table she would place near the front window. A bookstore was not just a place to buy books. It was a meeting point, a refuge, a battleground, a home. The landlord cleared his throat gently and told her the rent. She nodded, not flinching even though the number pressed heavily on her mind. She had saved carefully, worked long hours, taken risks that had left her exhausted and bruised. But she had not come this far, only to turn away now. She signed the papers with a steady hand, her signature looping across the page with quiet resolve. When he left, locking the door behind him, Una remained inside, standing in the silent room. She set her suitcase on the floor and opened it. Inside lay books she had carried from British Guiana, each one marked with the weight of her past. She pulled out one volume and placed it on the nearest shelf. Its spine leaned unevenly against splintered wood. But to her, it looked like the first brick of a foundation she had dreamed of long before she ever believed she could build it. Outside, footsteps passed along the sidewalk, and voices carried through the window. She could hear snatches of conversation about protests, about sit-ins spreading across the South, about young students refusing to leave segregated lunch counters. The country was stirring. Change was rising from cities, towns, and rural roads alike. Harlem felt alive, buzzing with tension and anticipation. People were searching for knowledge, searching for direction, searching for tools that could help them navigate the shifting tides of a nation confronting its deepest wounds. Books could offer that. She believed that with her entire being. She moved toward the window, wiping a smudge of dust from the glass. The street outside reflected in rippled patterns, distorted by age fishbound. Yet she could see her own silhouette faintly, standing in the doorway of a future she could not yet fully imagine. She whispered to herself, not as a declaration, but as a promise. She would build this. She would fill these shelves. She would make this space matter. As the day stretched toward afternoon, she began clearing the room. She stacked abandoned boxes, swept dust into small piles, and inspected every corner, noting what needed repair. Her hands grew raw from lifting and carrying, but she felt lighter with each task. This store would not open overnight. It would require time, sweat, and patience. But she had all three. She had cultivated endurance in places far harsher than this quiet room in Harlem. By evening, the light dimmed to a pale blue, and the streets grew softer with the slow approach of dusk. Una finally stepped outside, locking the door carefully, the new key cold in her hand. She looked up at the window one more time. Behind it was nothing but an empty room. But she saw more than that. She saw possibility taking shape, waiting to be given breath. The wind pushed past her again, lifting the ends of her coat as if urging her forward. She turned toward the avenue, her steps steady and her pulse calm. She carried no illusions about what lay ahead. The world was changing, but change was never gentle. Still, as she walked toward the bus stop, one truth remained firm. She had opened a doorway on 131st Street, not just for herself, but for a movement that had been rising long before she returned to Harlem. And soon, the people who would shape that movement would begin to walk through it. The first weeks inside the empty space on 131st Street were marked by the thud of hammers, the rasp of sandpaper, and the low hum of determination that followed Una Mulzac from sunrise to dusk. She arrived early each morning with her coat buttoned tight against the winter air and a notebook tucked beneath her arm. The notes inside were simple. Lists of authors to stock, shipping contacts who might supply rare titles, tentative schedules for the first weeks of opening. But the pages also held questions that troubled her. Would people come? Would the store survive? Could a single bookstore carry the weight of a community's struggle during one of the most turbulent moments in American history? The civil rights movement was gaining momentum across the country. But Harlem had its own rhythm, its own politics, its own long-standing wounds. Una understood this deeply. She understood it from her childhood spent listening to her father, a man unafraid to speak of colonial oppression, racism, and the fight for black unity. She understood it from British Guyana, where she had seen what happened when people demanded change. Knowledge gave people courage, and courage often came with a cost. Liberation Bookstore, she knew, would be more than a shop. It would be a statement. Every day she worked to turn the dusty room into a home for that statement. She repaired the warped shelves by hand, bracing them with new planks she bought from a hardware store a few blocks away. She painted the walls in careful strokes until the room felt lighter, almost warm despite the cold that crept through the old brick. When her arms ached, she took short breaks. Leaning against the window to watch Harlem pass by, children raced past with their school bags bouncing behind them. Older men stood in knots on the corner, newspapers folded beneath their arms. Women moved briskly with grocery bags, pausing only to greet neighbors. The city breathed in its steady, complicated rhythm, as if reminding her of the purpose that had carried her across continents and years. Soon the books began to arrive, first in small packages and then in heavier shipments that filled the narrow front room. Titles from Africa, the Caribbean, and the United States formed uneven towers on the floor. Works by W.E.B. Du Bois, Langston Hughes, Richard Wright, Claudia Jones, and Frantz Fanon pressed against one another like pieces of a living history waiting to be read. Una lifted each volume carefully, studying the covers, the weight of the paper, the scent of fresh ink or old pages. She placed them on the shelves with the quiet reverence of someone arranging tools for a battle she knew was already underway. Word spread slowly, carried by conversation more than advertisement. A friend mentioned to a neighbor that a new black bookstore was coming to Harlem. A teacher from a nearby school stopped by to ask whether Una planned to carry textbooks about African history, the kind rarely found in mainstream stores. A postal worker lingered at the door during one of his routes, curious about the stacks of books and the woman who was arranging them with steady, purposeful hands. Every visitor brought questions, suggestions, and stories. Some shared their memories of earlier bookstores that had closed. Others voiced their hope that this one would last. Every voice added pressure, but also strength. One afternoon, while sunlight filtered through the window in pale gold tones, a young man stepped inside for the first time. He wore a worn coat and carried a notebook filled with loose pages. He introduced himself as a writer trying to find a place to read, think, and maybe find inspiration. Una listened carefully, her expression warm. She told him he was welcome to sit and read any time he wished. She offered him a chair she had placed near the shelves. As he settled into it, flipping open a book of poetry, Una felt the first true sense of what the store could become. A place where voices were not only heard, but also nurtured. In the weeks that followed, she continued building the store's identity. She arranged displays that highlighted authors whose works were often dismissed or ignored by mainstream bookstores. She wrote letters to publishers requesting discounted shipments for community use. She invited local educators to browse her growing collection and recommend additional titles. The store was taking shape, but so was something larger, a sense of gathering. Outside the walls of Liberation Bookstore, Harlem pulsed with rising tension. Protests grew larger across the country as sit-ins increased, boycotts spread, and young activists demanded justice with unshakable resolve. Newspapers carried photographs of students facing jeering crowds and lines of police. Radios crackled with reports of arrests and resistance. Conversations in barbershops, churches, and street corners grew sharper. People debated strategy, questioned leadership, and argued passionately about the future of the movement. Inside the store, those same conversations began to unfold. Visitors discussed the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, the growing influence of Malcolm X, the push for school integration, and the urgent need for communities to educate themselves. Sometimes the discussions were quiet. Other times they filled the room with fierce energy that made the walls seem to vibrate. Una welcomed all of it. She believed that knowledge sharpened minds and prepared people for the struggles ahead. Her past had taught her that a movement could not thrive without information. In British Guiana, she had witnessed how colonial authorities tried to silence dissent by limiting what people could read and share. She refused to allow ignorance to be used as a weapon in Harlem. Liberation Bookstore was both shield and sword, a place where truth overcame silence. Still, challenges weighed heavily on her. Rent was high. Income was uncertain. She often worked late into the night, accounting for every dollar spent and earned. She cleaned the store alone, organized shelves by lantern light, and drafted plans for community events she hoped to host once the doors officially opened. Exhaustion pulled at her, but purpose kept her upright. One evening, as she locked up for the night, a man stopped her on the sidewalk. He introduced himself with a firm handshake, saying he had heard rumors about a new bookstore dedicated to Black literature. His voice carried a mix of curiosity and admiration. He said Harlem needed a place where people could learn about their own history without censorship. After a brief conversation, he told her he would return with friends who had been searching for a space like this. His words lingered long after he walked away. By the time spring approached, the bookstore felt alive, even before its official opening. The shelves stood firm, filled with titles that traced the struggles and triumphs of Black people across the diaspora. The air carried the faint smell of ink and wood polish, and the front window gleamed with a new sign that read, Liberation Bookstore, in bold, confident lettering. Una paused in the doorway one evening, gazing at the room she had transformed. She thought of every challenge she had endured to reach this point, and every challenge that still waited in the shadows. But she also felt the weight of hope. She had built the shelves. Soon the people who needed them would come. The store was ready. Harlem was stirring, and history was pressing closer to the door with each passing day, waiting for a place to land. The first day, Liberation Bookstore opened its doors. The morning light fell across the shelves like a quiet blessing. Una Mulzac arrived before sunrise, her fingers shaking only slightly as she unlocked the door. The bell above the frame chimed with a soft metallic ring, a sound she hoped would soon become familiar. She adjusted the stack of flyers near the counter, straightened the display of new arrivals, and exhaled slowly as she stepped back. After years of dreaming, planning, and scraping together everything she had, the store no longer belonged only to her. It now belonged to Harlem. By noon, the first wave of visitors arrived, drawn not by advertisements, but by whispers and curiosity. A mailman stepped inside on his lunch break, shifting the weight of his satchel as he scanned the shelves. An older woman, her hair wrapped in a patterned scarf, walked directly to the history section and lifted a book by J.A. Rogers with a look of recognition so profound, it seemed almost like grief. A group of teenagers lingered near the back, picking up political pamphlets and reading in low murmurs as if testing their own voices. Each person moved through the space with a mix of reverence and hunger, as though the books carried something they had been denied for too long. Una watched them quietly, greeting each visitor with a warm nod. She did not hover or push. She had built this space so that people could discover it freely, claim it as their own, and speak without fear of dismissal. Harlem had long needed places where Black readers could find themselves on the page, places where truth was not softened or reshaped to fit someone else's comfort. Liberation Bookstore was intended to be one of those places. The first writer to step inside was a young man named Roland, who had visited during the store's renovation and returned now carrying a manuscript tucked inside his coat. He approached Una hesitantly, as if expecting to be turned away. She invited him to sit near the front window and listened as he spoke about the plays he was trying to write, stories rooted in the lives of the people he grew up with. He said he had been searching for a space where he could study the works of writers who had shaped the movement. Una showed him books by Lorraine Hansberry, James Baldwin, and Gwendolyn Brooks. He thumbed through each one with careful wonder, whispering lines under his breath. As days passed, more writers found their way inside. Some came seeking fuel for their work. Others came seeking community. They filled the air with conversations about craft, politics, and the urgent need for Black voices to be heard not only in protests, but also in literature, journalism, and the arts. Students from nearby schools began stopping in after class, drawn by the window display or the sight of neighbors gathered around stacks of books. Teachers visited too, asking for recommendations for their classrooms or discussing how the store might help shape new reading lists centered on Black history. One evening, just as Una prepared to close, a group of young activists entered the shop. Their jackets were damp with early spring rain, and their voices carried the unmistakable urgency of people who were learning to sharpen their convictions. They scanned the shelves for writings by Malcolm X, Fanon, and Angela Davis, speaking rapidly about rallies, meetings, and voter registration drives. They asked Una questions about colonial resistance, African liberation movements, and police surveillance in Harlem. She answered as best she could, drawing from her own experiences in British Guiana and her lifelong immersion in political struggle. The store began to take on the feeling of an underground heartbeat, steady and unshakable. It was not a hidden place, yet it carried a sense of being a part, a space where people could breathe more freely than on the crowded streets outside. Una noticed that visitors often lingered longer than they intended. They paused beside strangers to discuss passages from books, exchanging ideas as if passing fire from one hand to another. Arguments arose too, sharp at times, but never cruel. Debate was necessary. In a community tested by history, silence had never been a luxury. Writers began suggesting readings and small gatherings. At first, Una hesitated, unsure whether the store was ready for such events. But one Saturday afternoon, when a local poet asked whether he could share a new piece with whomever happened to be browsing, Una nodded. The poet stood near the center aisle, cleared his throat, and began to read. His voice carried a slow, burning intensity that pulled every listener into his rhythm. People stopped mid-stride, setting aside books to listen. When he finished, the store erupted in soft applause. For a moment, the room felt taller, as if the walls themselves had absorbed his words. After that, Readings became more frequent. Writers came not only to buy books, but also to test their voices, to hear the responses of neighbors who understood the weight of their stories. Some evenings, the store stayed open long after dark, lit by warm lamps that cast gold across the shelves. The conversations ranged from poetry to housing rights, from Caribbean independence movements to the strategies unfolding among civil rights groups across the South. People spoke of hope and frustration, of danger and dreams, of victories won and battles still looming. Every conversation added another thread to the growing community forming inside the small bookstore. Yet not all visitors arrived seeking warmth or camaraderie. A few came quietly, glancing over their shoulders as they stepped inside. One man, tall and thin, entered one evening and asked for materials on African independence movements. His questions were cautious, his gaze steady. He said little, but his presence lingered with Una. She had met men like him before, men who believed deeply in liberation, but understood the price of being seen as part of a movement that authorities watched closely. Another visitor, a young woman studying law, came regularly to research court cases involving racial discrimination. She often stayed until closing, surrounded by stacks of legal texts and political essays, determined to understand every angle of the system she hoped to challenge. Through all of this, the bookstore grew not only in reputation, but also in importance. People spoke of it in barbershops, churches, apartments, and school corridors. They said it was a place where truth was shelved openly, a place where knowledge was not watered down or buried, a place that belonged to them. Una watched the transformation with a mixture of pride and humility. She had hoped the store would matter, but she had not expected it to become a gathering point so quickly. Some evenings she stood behind the counter and let the voices wash over her, feeling the power of what she had built. It was not the shelves, or the paint, or the sign in the window that made Liberation Bookstore alive. It was the people who refused to be silent, who stepped through the door carrying questions, hopes, and the determination to understand their place in a world that had long tried to diminish them. The community was forming. Its spark had been struck. And though storms were gathering far beyond Harlem's borders, the flame inside Liberation Bookstore only burned brighter with each passing day. By the time summer settled over Harlem, the air carried a heaviness that felt almost electric. It clung to the brick walls, drifted through open windows, and buzzed beneath the surface of daily conversation. Liberation. Bookstore stood quietly on 131st Street, but nothing outside its doors was quiet. The civil rights movement was pressing forward across the nation, and Harlem felt each wave of it as if the streets themselves were wired to the pulse of distant marches. Una Mulzac could sense it the moment she unlocked the store each morning. The tension was in the hurried footsteps on the sidewalk, the sharp voices rising from street corners, the way people leaned in close when they talked about sit-ins, voting rights, and police brutality. Inside the store, she tried to build a refuge, but even refuge had limits when the world refused to leave it untouched. She watched through the front window as groups gathered on the sidewalks, arguing about strategies and leadership. Some spoke of nonviolence. Others insisted the time for calm had long passed. The police presence grew heavier with each passing week. Patrol cars crawled along the avenues, and officers monitored youth gatherings with expressions hardened by suspicion. It was becoming clear that Harlem was not simply observing the movement, but living inside it. Una felt the change first in the conversations that unfolded between the shelves. Visitors no longer lingered with the easy curiosity of early spring. They spoke with sharper edges now, fueled by news from the South, where protesters faced clubs, fire hoses, and arrests. The freedom rides had shaken the nation, and Harlem's residents followed every update with trembling intensity. Reports of bombings, beatings, and disappearances spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. Each story tightened the air a little more, and people arrived at the bookstore searching not only for information, but for understanding, for grounding, for some way to make sense of the danger sweeping the country. The bookstore became a place where fear and determination coexisted. Writers gathered in hushed circles, contemplating how to respond to the escalating tension. Several wanted to publish essays or pamphlets that called for stronger action. Others feared that such open statements would bring police attention to the store. Una listened to each side carefully. She did not shy away from hard truths. She had witnessed state repression firsthand in British Guyana. She understood the way governments could turn suspicion into violence with stunning speed. Still, she reminded the writers that knowledge was fuel for the movement, and that silence invited its own dangers. Police officers began appearing more frequently outside the window. Sometimes they paused long enough for visitors to take notice. Other times they walked past slowly, their eyes sweeping the interior of the shop. No laws were being broken inside, yet the sense of being watched hovered over the shelves like an unwelcome shadow. Several activists whispered that the bookstore might already be on the radar of law enforcement, especially given Una's political history abroad. She did not dismiss the possibility. She only urged everyone to stay focused on truth, even when truth attracted scrutiny. The tension grew sharper after a series of protests in Harlem drew large crowds. Demonstrators demanded fair housing, jobs, and an end to discriminatory policing. The marches were loud, determined, and filled with young people who had studied the very books that lined Una's shelves. She saw several familiar faces among them. Young men and women who often came to the store after school or work. They held signs they had painted themselves and moved with a confidence that had grown from months of reading and debate. But with the energy of protest came the threat of confrontation. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the tenements, a scuffle broke out between demonstrators and police. Sirens screamed across the blocks. Shouts rose like fire, sharp and chaotic. Una stepped to the doorway, watching in alarm as the crowd surged. People ran past the store, some shoving others to safety, some throwing desperate glances over their shoulders. For a moment she stood frozen, her heart pounding with the memory of political crackdowns in British Guyana. She knew too well what a single spark could ignite. When the chaos finally faded, several protesters found their way to the bookstore seeking shelter and calm. Una let them sit inside, offering water and a place to steady themselves. One young woman, her knees scraped from falling on the pavement, told Una that the police had grabbed people at random. Her voice trembled, not with fear alone, but with anger. She said she would return to the next protest, no matter the risk. Her determination reminded Una of the activists she had worked with abroad, people who understood that change demanded sacrifice. The next morning, a new calm settled over the blocks. But it was the kind of calm that comes only after a storm has passed and another waits just beyond the horizon. The newspapers carried headlines about the clash. Journalists interviewed police officers who insisted they had responded with restraint. The protesters' version of events was different, and Harlem believed its own. Inside Liberation Bookstore, the mood shifted. Conversations that once centered on literature and philosophy now turned toward strategy and survival. People asked which leaders were gaining influence, which organizations were growing, which alliances were forming. The speeches of Malcolm X echoed in their discussions, sharp and uncompromising. The words of King were studied and critiqued. Visitors debated whether the movement needed unity or diversity of tactics. The arguments were intense, but beneath them lay a shared understanding that Harlem was entering a new phase of struggle. Una remained steady through the changes, though she sensed the weight of danger pressing closer. One afternoon, a man entered the shop and lingered without speaking. He picked up books at random, flipping through pages without truly reading. His gaze followed every whisper, every exchange. After he left, one of the regular customers approached Una and said he recognized the man from another meeting place, rumored to be monitored by undercover officers. Una nodded quietly, knowing there was little she could do except remain cautious. Surveillance was not new to her. She had lived under its shadow before, yet she would not allow fear to hollow out the heart of the store. She continued ordering new shipments of books, expanding the political section and inviting writers to share their work. She believed in the power of collective knowledge. It was stronger than intimidation, stronger than silence. Liberation Bookstore was built to withstand pressure, built from the resolve of a woman who had already survived attempts to silence her abroad. Harlem was facing storms, but so was the entire nation. Through every shift in the wind, the bookstore remained a place where people gathered not to hide but to prepare. As summer deepened, sunlight slanted through the front window in warm gold, casting long shadows across the floor. The world outside was restless. The world inside was determined. And though danger lurked in every corner of the movement, the bookstore stood firm, ready for whatever came next. The storm outside the windows was growing, but so was the fire in the hearts of the people who stepped through the door each day. Autumn arrived in Harlem with wind that rattled the window panes of Liberation Bookstore. But inside the narrow shop, a different kind of warmth had taken root. The shelves now carried more books than Una Mulzac had dreamed possible when she first stepped into the dusty room months earlier. The scent of ink, paper, and worn wooden floors mixed with a low hum of conversation that never seemed to leave the air. Liberation Bookstore had become something more than a shop. It had become a sanctuary, a place where activists, students, artists, and ordinary neighbors came seeking clarity, strength, or simply a moment of belonging in a world that refused to stand still. Nearly every afternoon, the door swung open in steady rhythm as people drifted inside. Some came for specific titles they had heard about through word of mouth. Others arrived with questions that had no simple answers. Many came because they needed a place where they could speak without the weight of judgment pressing down. Una greeted them all with calm steadiness, offering guidance when asked and silence when needed. She understood that the movement was not only shaped in marches and speeches, but also in the quiet corners where people wrestled with ideas, fears, and the complicated path toward liberation. Local activists began treating the bookstore as a headquarters of sorts, though no formal sign declared it so. Young organizers met at the back table to discuss upcoming rallies, draft leaflets, and study the writings of thinkers who had challenged oppression around the world. They pored over the works of Fanon, Padmore, and Nkrumah, tracing the connections between colonial struggles abroad and the fight for civil rights at home. Una often overheard them connecting strategies from Africa and the Caribbean to the evolving movement in the United States. Their voices carried equal parts determination and uncertainty. Yet there was never doubt in their desire to change the world they had inherited. College students from City College and other nearby institutions flocked to the store between classes. Many were first-generation scholars who felt suffocated by the narrowness of their assigned reading lists. In Liberation Bookstore, they found texts that spoke to their lived experience, books that named the injustices they saw daily and placed them within long histories of resistance. Some stayed for hours, sitting cross-legged on the floor with notebooks open, filling pages with ideas and questions that had no room in their lecture halls. Una walked among them quietly, answering what she could, and pointing them toward authors who had wrestled with the same questions decades earlier. Middle school and high school students came too, often in groups, crowding around shelves that introduced them to figures they had never encountered in their classrooms. They discovered leaders from the Harlem Renaissance, resistance fighters from across the diaspora, and political thinkers who refused to soften the truth. Their eyes widened with each new revelation. They asked about Malcolm X, whose speeches echoed through the neighborhood. They asked about segregation, colonialism, and the meaning of revolution. They asked why their schools gave them only pieces of a much bigger story. Una answered each question patiently, guiding them toward deeper understanding without pushing them faster than they were ready to go. Writers continued to gather as well, filling the shop with a creative energy that pulsed beneath the daily discussions of politics and history. Some read early drafts of poems or essays to small circles of listeners. Others scribbled furiously in notebooks while leaning against the shelves, capturing ideas sparked by conversations overheard near the counter. The store offered them inspiration, but it also offered them safety. Many writers had been discouraged elsewhere, dismissed for confronting themes that made publishers uneasy. Here, their voices were welcomed. Here, their stories mattered. Through all of this activity, Liberation Bookstore gained a reputation as a refuge for those who cared deeply about the fight for justice. But its role extended beyond intellectual discussion. The store became a lifeline for people who needed a place to steady themselves amid the turbulence of the era. Some came simply to breathe. The world outside was relentless. Protests erupted across the country. Police surveillance grew more suffocating. Economic pressures strained families across Harlem. Between the headlines and the constant threat of violence, the bookstore offered a rare pocket of calm where people could gather their thoughts and remind themselves why the struggle mattered. It was not uncommon for someone to stand silently before a shelf, one hand pressed against a book's spine, lost in a moment of reflection. Others came to confide in Una about fears they dared not voice elsewhere. She listened with compassion, always careful not to push her own story forward unless it helped them find courage. She spoke at times of British Guyana, of resistance, of state repression, and of the dangers that accompany truth. Her experiences resonated with those who feared the weight of surveillance in Harlem. She had lived under scrutiny, had faced intimidation, and had refused to be silenced. Her resilience gave others hope that survival was not only possible, but purposeful. One evening, a young activist named Marcia arrived, shaken, after witnessing police aggression during a local demonstration. She sank into a chair near the counter, her hands trembling. Una brought her tea and sat beside her quietly until the young woman found her breath. Marcia spoke of fear, of the uncertainty that had washed over her when the crowd scattered. She questioned her place in the movement. She wondered whether she had the strength to continue. Una listened, then told her gently that courage was not the absence of fear, but the choice to move through it with purpose. Marcia returned the next day, and the day after that, ready once more to fight for the world she believed in. Moments like this unfolded often. Liberation Bookstore was shaping a new generation. One reader, one thinker, one uncertain heartbeat at a time. It offered not only books, but also stability in a world that threatened to tear people apart. Each person who stepped inside left carrying something more than they had brought with them. Whether it was knowledge, resolve, or simply the reassurance that they were not alone in the struggle. By late autumn, the store's reputation reached beyond Harlem. Activists from other boroughs visited, seeking rare publications and community connection. Scholars traveled uptown to witness firsthand the place they had heard referenced in political meetings and cultural circles. Some came because they believed the bookstore represented the intellectual foundation of a movement that was both local and global. Others came because they knew that spaces of liberation, once built, must be protected. As the sun set earlier each day, casting long shadows across the floorboards, Una often stood in the quiet moments before closing and took in the sight of the store she had built. The shelves were no longer empty. The chairs were worn from use. The walls hummed with the energy of voices that had filled the room for months. Liberation Bookstore had grown into a sanctuary, not because Una planned it that way, but because the people of Harlem needed it to be so. In a world that demanded silence from those who challenged injustice, the store gave them a place to gather, speak, learn, and prepare for the battles ahead. Outside, the storm of the civil rights era raged on. But inside 131st Street, a new generation was taking shape, ready to step into the fire with knowledge as their shield and their guide. Winter crept into Harlem on a wind sharp enough to slice through the cracks in old brick buildings, but Liberation Bookstore glowed with a warmth that defied the cold. The lamps along the shelves cast amber light across rows of books that had passed through countless hands. Some were new and crisp. Others were worn, their spines softened by the turning of many pages. Each one carried a story, and together they formed a mosaic of a people searching for liberation in a nation struggling to confront its own contradictions. By now, the bookstore had become more than a gathering place. It had become a symbol, a quiet heartbeat in the center of Harlem's ongoing fight for justice. Una Mulzac felt the weight of this transformation every morning as she unlocked the door. She had never intended to build a monument, nor had she set out to become a figure people followed with admiration or caution. She simply wanted to give Harlem a place where truth could be found on the shelves, unfiltered and unapologetic. Yet, as the civil rights movement intensified across the country, the store grew in significance. People arrived not only to read, but to witness what a determined community could build when they refused to surrender their voice. Visitors began traveling from outside New York, seeking the bookstore they had heard mentioned in speeches, pamphlets, or quiet conversations. College students from the South who came north during school breaks stepped inside with wide eyes, stunned to see entire shelves dedicated to Black history, African independence movements, and radical thought they could not find at home. Some stood silently for long stretches, absorbing the enormity of the knowledge before them. Others eagerly sought Una's guidance, asking for reading lists or recommendations that would help them navigate the political landscape unfolding across the country. Writers who had once struggled to find readers discovered that Liberation Bookstore had become a testing ground for their work. If their words resonated within these walls, they often found a broader audience beyond Harlem. Una supported them whenever she could. She displayed their pamphlets near the counter, organized readings that drew crowds from nearby streets, and wrote personal notes to accompany books she believed deserved greater attention. Her instincts were sharp, shaped by years of studying resistance movements around the world. she knew when a voice carried not only talent, but also necessity. The store also attracted leaders and thinkers whose influence extended far beyond the neighborhood. Activists engaged in national struggles stopped by when they were in New York, blending into the small gatherings that formed naturally near the back table. They sat shoulder to shoulder with local youth, exchanging ideas in tones that ranged from fiery to contemplative. Some came anonymously, slipping in and out quietly so as not to draw attention. Others allowed themselves to be recognized, understanding that their presence energized the community and affirmed the store's importance. Media attention followed, though not always in ways that brought comfort. Reporters visited, eager to capture photographs of what they called a cultural stronghold. Some wrote glowing reviews, praising the bookstore as a cornerstone of Black intellectual life. Others viewed the store through a political lens, describing it with language that hinted at suspicion. Una read those articles carefully, knowing that public visibility was a double-edged sword. Liberation Bookstore was no stranger to surveillance, and with each new article, the sense of being watched intensified. Still, she refused to let fear dictate the store's path. She continued expanding her inventory, seeking out works from across the African diaspora, adding more titles by women whose voices had too often been overshadowed. She worked tirelessly to keep prices accessible, sometimes selling books at cost or allowing customers to pay in installments. For those who could not afford even that, she kept a quiet stack behind the counter that she loaned without question. Knowledge, she believed, should never be withheld from those who needed it most. The bookstore also became a refuge during moments of national crisis. When news broke of bombings, assassinations, and clashes across the South, people gathered inside to grieve, to rage, and to steady themselves. They debated strategy, questioned leadership, and shared memories of friends or relatives who had faced violence in the name of justice. The air inside the store grew thick with emotion on those days. But even then, the room felt anchored by the books that lined the walls. Each title served as a reminder that generations before them had endured similar battles and that their own fight was part of a larger, unbroken continuum. Some nights, after she had sent the last lingering visitor home, Una locked the door and stood alone in the dimly lit shop. She traced the spines of the books with her fingertips, feeling the weight of the stories they carried. She thought of her father, of British Guyana, of the fire that had nearly taken her life, and of the long path that had led her back to Harlem. She never imagined that her quiet defiance would ripple outward in ways she could neither predict nor control. Yet she also knew that movements often grew from the smallest acts, the ones performed without expectation of recognition. By the late 1960s and early 1970s, Liberation Bookstore's reputation extended across the country. Travelers from Chicago, Detroit, Oakland, and Atlanta made pilgrimages to Harlem specifically to visit it. Many left with books that would influence their activism, scholarship, or art. Some carried home rare titles that would become foundational texts in Black studies programs, as universities slowly began acknowledging the value of the histories long ignored or suppressed. Others carried home an impression of the store itself, a space where community, courage, and knowledge intertwined. The bookstore's impact reached beyond individuals. It contributed to the intellectual backbone of organizations rising throughout the era. The shelves held materials that fueled liberation movements abroad, civil rights strategies at home, and the cultural renaissance that was taking root in Harlem, shaping music, poetry, theater, and visual arts. Even those who never stepped inside felt its influence through the people it educated and empowered. Una never boasted about the scale of the bookstore's legacy. She moved quietly through her days, shelving books, offering recommendations, and keeping the space open even during the hardest years when political pressure and economic strain threatened to close it. Her strength lay not in grand gestures, but in persistence. Every morning she unlocked the door. Every evening she kept the lamp burning a little longer for the reader who needed those last few minutes of refuge. In her steadiness, people found resilience. Liberation Bookstore stood as proof that a single place, built with conviction, could radiate influence far beyond its walls. It was a beacon not because of its size, but because of its purpose. The books it offered illuminated histories long buried. The conversations it held shaped minds preparing to step into the broader fight for freedom. And the woman at its center, who never sought fame, became nonetheless a figure remembered for her quiet, unwavering courage. In the end, Liberation Bookstore was more than shelves, pages, and a narrow room on 131st Street. It was a testament to what happens when truth is given a home. And long after visitors stepped back into the noise of Harlem's streets, they carried that light with them, spreading it into classrooms, marches, living rooms, and movements that would continue unfolding long after Una locked the door each night. The beacon she lit did not dim, it multiplied.